Good morning. I am a wanderer. This concept is rooted in Greek and describes one who deviates from the correct path or misses the mark in an erroneous fashion, often with disastrous results. Labeling myself as such puts me at odds with antiquity, at least in this instance. I want to tell you all a story about traveling back to the US from Poland, where I'd spent the summer as my great Uncle Wally's caretaker on a trip to visit family. I was 26, and like many of you, traveling was my addiction, my endgame, for nearly everything that I did. By my third decade, I'd become precious in my search of settings that didn't involve tour buses, museum guides, or anything containing the words club or all-inclusive. I had already spent a summer living in a tent in southern France, serving as an apprentice mason on an abandoned chateau, another playing lacrosse in the UK, one in Senegal, West Africa, on a dancing and drumming workshop, and still another studying painting in Florence. Many of you know that my husband and I met one another while traveling alone on the North Island in New Zealand, I there to work on a sheep farm in Whitianga, and he to hike the Abel Tasman Trail. It's a good story that either of us is happy to tell, just ask. Beyond meeting my best friend, I cannot possibly list all that I've gained through extensive time spent in unfamiliar environs. Make no mistake, I wasn't raised this way. Like you all, I attended strong schools, and I thrived in all areas connected to the structured environment of residential educational settings. I lived in a small city where my parents both grew up and where their parents both grew up. Holidays were local, with all members of both sides of the family present, piled into whichever avocado green dining room belonged to whomever turn it was to host. We ate the same meal for all holidays: dried out turkey, washed down with orange and grape tonic, AKA soda, stuffed shells, chicken cacciatore, Italian salad, pizzelles, and apple pie, and I loved it. During the summer months, we made the requisite New England pilgrimages to the Cape, southern Maine, New Hampshire, but not Vermont, that's where the hippies lived, along with special trips to Lake George, Montreal, and of course, Disney. One summer, my parents piled us into the station wagon to head way north and east to the Bay of Fundy in Prince Edward Island because they had read about it in Consumers Reports. During the drive, my sister and I played Crazy Eights in the Wayback, uttering affirmative noises when my father implored us to look around and take in the beautiful scenery. I was as fussy and non-committal as any normal, typical 11-year-old family traveler. But then I turned 12, and that meant that my sister was 14, and that meant we could take the bus to Boston by ourselves. Most Saturday mornings, before club teams were even a twinkle in the eye of any NESCAC college coach, we'd dig up whatever allowance money we could find, along with any loose change that had fallen beneath the cushions of the couch, from the back pockets of the steady stream of relatives that had stopped over to chat during the week. We'd walk down to the bus stop at the corner of Maple and Edinburgh and head into the big city. We didn't quite know where we were going in, but we thrilled at the idea of exploring. We found Quincy Market first, and then we wove our way over to Downtown Crossing, eventually connecting both sections to the sparkle of Newbury Street and Back Bay. They were all sewn together by the eloquent urban greenery of the Common. After a few weeks, we figured out which side of the Common was fancy and which one was sketchy, and how to navigate the T. We window shopped, bought ice cream, people watched, chatted, and logged in too many foot-trafficked miles to count, pre-apps and pre-Fitbits. We figured out which outfits made us blend into this slick Boston yuppie crowd, which bakery cut its prices in half after 3 o'clock, and which stores had the best, most easily accessed restrooms. We daydreamed about what it would be like to live in our own apartment with our own pots and pans, and we swore we'd have napkin holders on our tables and tiebacks on our curtains. We'd order fresh flowers for our entryways every week, and we'd be known personally by local merchants and coffee shop owners. We had no iPhones, we had no schedules, no agendas, no plans. we were lost. We were free. Fast forward. I was at UPenn during my senior year. I had turned 21 during the previous summer, and an injury had cut short my final season on Franklin Field. But truthfully, I wasn't all that disappointed. I didn't really fit in with that crowd. Half of my friends were busy interviewing or training for the jobs or graduate programs that they knew they wanted immediately following graduation, and the others were getting drunk, getting engaged, or both. I didn't fit in with any of them either. I was finishing up my classes, environmental design studies with minors in music and art. I was still playing the piano at the New Deck Tavern on Sansom Street on Thursday and Friday nights, but lately the Kenny brothers had been in the papers for some shady stuff, and my sometime friend and unofficial bodyguard, Cy, hadn't been showing up to chain smoke and glare at anyone who paid too much attention to me. Amanda from California had just presented her really shoddy, term-long architectural project that she'd banged out in 2 sleepless nights, and she was a good talker, so she was getting away with it. My painting teacher was playing mind games, and I couldn't seem to stay up long enough to make it to any of the frat parties on Locust Walk. Whatever. I was over it all. Everything felt derivative, canned, and predetermined. Despite my incredible good fortune at having the opportunity to attend such a tremendous college, I was bored and lost, and only vaguely aware of a dull hum of terror connected to my potentially permanent departure from academia, the environment that I'd been working hard to decipher and conquer during the course of these past 15 years. What on earth was I going to do next? So after an epic stumble in a class called Physics for Poets, or Physics for really, really terrible science students like me, I decided to design my own course called Amy Wanders in Philadelphia. Truthfully, it wasn't an official class, but that's what I called it. And that's what I ended up doing when I wasn't generally fulfilling my basic school and work responsibilities. In my pre-adulthood crisis, I determined the city of brotherly love to be, at minimum, a real place, and thus worthy of getting to know better before I left, possibly forever. During the next 5 months, I discovered the intricacies of the bus routes, a particularly beautiful exposed brick cafe in Rittenhouse Square, a really cool new clothing store called Anthropology, a rare bookshop on South Street, boutique art galleries, and a plethora of murals and mosaics, flanked by beautifully weathered apartment buildings. I found the jazz clubs down near the water, just across the harbor from New Jersey, and I returned to campus to read about Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, and Sarah Vaughan. I wandered up to the 3rd floors of estate sales. I ate soup at Bookbinders, because it was all I could afford, and I bought a ticket to David Byrne's Stop Making Sense, shown in an abandoned Baptist church. I got to know the bus drivers, cheesesteak vendors, cops, and street sweepers, and one night my buddy Cy, who had reappeared, treated me to a venison dinner served in a lovely little restaurant hidden behind a fallen-down door in South Philly. It was in exchange for a painting. Thank goodness I didn't take the cash instead, which I desperately needed at the time. I still hung out with my friends at school and went to my work-study job at the T-Square Cafe in the architectural building, and even called my parents occasionally. But something had changed. My panic had begun to subside. I'd begun to accept my confusion, my lack of definite direction, and my potential spot in a world without midterms, school IDs, and lunch trays. I was on a path, one found by losing myself in a real city, with real people, art, food, and culture. I took comfort in marching among the urbanly invisible. Perhaps some of you have had the same experience, and you know what I'm talking about. So, back to my story about coming home from Poland. Uncle Wally and I had had quite the trip, shuttling around the winding streets of Krakow, walking for miles in public parks, and eyeing each other silently while sneaking phlegmy, fat-laced mystery meat under the table to the dogs, when Cousin Teresa, who could easily defeat Owen Rosenberger on the mats, had her back turned. At the end of our stay, we found ourselves on an overnight train from Warsaw, headed back over the border into Frankfurt, from where we'd fly back to Boston. Back in the 90s, it was really common practice to gamble on open cabins in Europe because the proper sleeper cars were so much more expensive, and usually you could snag a whole cabin for yourself, especially midweek in August. We'd been traveling with only carry-on, and I was wearing the second of my 2 pairs of socks. With shoes on, they made no statement, but with my shoes removed, which I did to lie across the seats to snooze, the smell was brutal. My Uncle Wally didn't care. He was 76 years old at the time, and both he and I were grateful for some sleep before we arrived in Germany. I heard them while I was dozing, their drunken banter reverberating from the walls of the halls of our train car. I knew there were lots of open cabins available. Please, please, no, I thought to myself, even as part of me knew that they were going to tap the silver rectangle that made the door slide open on our cabin, which, of course, they did. There were 2 guys, most likely in my decade. One was Irish and the other was British, and they were wasted, loud, and stinky. There went our stolen sleep. When traveling alone as a female in Europe, the first rule of thumb is to use polite silence as an advantage. Generally, a stranger that you'd rather not converse with won't know which language you speak if you can keep your face still and feign disinterest if they persist in engaging with any number of greetings in any number of EU tongues. When the Irish lad began his mischievous assault, attempting French, German, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese before eventually settling on his native, heavily accented English, to try and converse at 1:30 a.m., my uncle and I retreated into the safety net of silence after first sitting up and repositioning ourselves to sleep within the confines of our own individual seats. But Irish Boy was relentless, and not long after entering the car with Brit Boy, he began to bemoan the foot odor, mine, that filled the cabin with language, tone, and tenor that absolutely eviscerated both the innocent toes and the overall character of my poor uncle. I hung in there, staying silent, but it really wasn't fair. I was the offender, and poor Uncle Wally was not to blame. After 15 minutes of the constant assault, now joined by Brit Boy, I couldn't take it anymore. And I burst out that the smell wasn't from Wally's feet, but from mine, and why couldn't he just please leave my uncle alone and shut up so that we could sleep? In English. A triumphant smile crept over his red-cheeked face. Oh, I can't do an Irish accent. So you speak English? Well, guess what? I'm going to talk to you all night. You can just forget any idea you may have had about sleeping. And talk he did. For hours and hours, him slowly sobering, me initially furious, and then slowly softening. He was harmless. His friend slept, and eventually, about an hour before we arrived at the train station, so did he. I was wide awake then, flanked by the 3 of them, snoring and farting and reeking of booze and body odor, watching the trees and landscape and power lines rush past the dirty window. I was wired and feeling a little bit mischievous myself. So I took off my rancid socks and carefully tucked them into the pockets of the Irish boy's pants, 1 sock in each pocket. I laughed out loud, delighted by my private, largely harmless prank. I'd never see him again, and he'd wander around at least for an hour or 2, wondering where the stench was coming from. The next 30 minutes passed in a flash. We arrived in Germany, the doors opened, we grabbed our bags, checking groggily to be sure that we'd left behind nothing crucial. The train had arrived late, and we had only 10 minutes to make our connection to the other train that would get us to the airport to make our flight. Wally and I parted from the 2 boys and scanned the terminal board down the hall, shoving past people who were trying to do the same as politely as we could. We spotted our train and trotted through the open doors, sweating and relieved. The conductor came over to us and demanded payment in German currency. This was pre-Euro, and we only had Polish złotys. We had to make a decision, fast. Hesitation would mean we'd miss our flight home and have to find a place to stay overnight in Frankfurt and reschedule any number of commitments on the other side. It would be a disaster. Stay here with the bags, I told Wally, and I darted out to try and find somewhere to make the exchange, along with hundreds of other passengers coming from our late train who were trying to do the same. I ran about 100 yards, and then I saw him, the Irish boy, standing, smiling in the middle of the hall in a swirl of people. What happened next, I sometimes think maybe I'm making up or at least airbrushing in a dramatic, I'm living in a movie state of mind, but it really did happen. He was holding out his hand. I ran the rest of the way up to him and took the German coins from his hands, replacing them with the Polish ones. He then pointed down at the ground, and my eyes followed. He was laughing. He was wearing my socks. I shouted thanks, turned, and sprinted as fast as I could, weaving in and out of bodies and bundles, strollers and kiosks, back to the yellow-lit opening where Wally sat, hopeful with our bags, watching the distance between us close, wondering if it would be short enough. I leapt through the double doors as though a ribbon were splitting across my chest. They immediately shut behind me. The train lurched forward en route to the airport and to our waiting plane. We'd made it. History's filled with rampant wanderers. Henry David Thoreau, Virginia Woolf, Woody Allen, Charles Dickens, Constantine Brancusi, John Francis, and even Salinger's Holden Caulfield. It's a tradition that I continue to uphold, even now at 48, with a creative, steady job, having married my best friend, and now the mother of 3 extraordinary children. In my life, I've wandered in dozens of countries, cities, heaths, and trails, both marked and unmarked. My favorite routes these days still include the streets of Boston, but I also love to wander around any of the nearby coastal towns and beaches. Sometimes, if I'm lucky, my husband comes with me, and occasionally even one of my children will join. But I still often go alone, craving time and space to watch, wander, wonder, and learn. I'm certain there are wanderers among you all, artists, athletes, scientists, scholars, and the throngs of curious unlabeled. Still searching, you, becoming your beautiful, glorious, imperfect selves. May your adventures be colorful, safe, and sometimes without plan or obvious purpose, because those may be the ones that you love the best. Thank you.